It wasn't how any MP would like to leave Parliament. After years of service as a friend to farming, hunting and shooting, Neil Parish, Conservative MP and chair of the Environment Committee, walked into a storm that led to his resignation in 2022. 2 years later, he's back to his first love, farming. With the general election weeks away, maybe he got out at the right time. I meet him at his home in Somerset.
We know nothing. There's no manifestos out so far. But we have a suspicion that the broadly pro-hunting, pro-countryside MPs from the Conservative Party are going to take a bath. Is that fair?
Yes, that is a problem, and I think that I think people need to, in the countryside, need to work out where their bread is buttered, because while there's huge issues over Tories, and over the behaviour perhaps of various prime ministers, don't let that cloud your vision when you come to casting your vote, because you see, don't forget, Keir Starmer is the acceptable face of socialism, and then behind him is a party that's very left-wing. And yes, they're going to play very careful. We are more Tory than the Tories to get in. But after they get in, they've already targeted private schools, putting VAT on fees. They will do something on hunting. They will do something on shooting. They are just hugely politically correct. Look at how they've handled Diana Abbott, because I don't agree necessarily with Diane Abbott, but I do agree with her being able to say these things. But they've just stopped her, you see, because at the moment they mustn't frighten the horses. But when the election's over, the Labour Party, if they're in power, which is very likely, will be a different beast. And I think we in the countryside will have to be very careful.
You would say that because you spent your life as a Conservative MEP, MP, councillor. You've always been Conservatives. I would expect you to say that. Let us look at the reality if they do get in. What practically do you think it will mean for both hunting, shooting, fishing and farming in the countryside?
I think if Labour get in, then they will certainly tighten up the Hunting Act. They will also, I think, look very much at shooting. I think some of these big shoots are going to have to watch out.
They said they won't. They said they won't touch shooting.
Do you believe a politician? I've been in politics for many, many years, and I don't believe myself, let alone anyone else. But seriously, no. Like I said, it's all acceptable face to get in, isn't it? And once they're in, you see, in the end, Tony Blair had to throw, hunting to the left wing of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer so far has just thrown the VAT on schools, but he'll need more. I used to be in there when there were debates on Israel in the past, and the left wing of the Labour Party is so anti-Israel, and they would all come piling into the chamber. And they are there. They are just quiet at the moment because every political party, when it wants to get back into power, always moderates, always puts its headbangers into a cupboard and locks them up. Labour is very successful at that. The Tories much less so. And so I would be very careful what you wish for, because what is Starmer telling us, really? Absolutely nothing. All he's doing is saying these Tories are dreadful and vote for me, and we'll have the new land of milk and honey. No real policy there, and I think he'll find that things will get very difficult for him very quickly because there's a lot of borrowing. He will want to spend more money. He's saying he's not going to tax, well, he will, and I think he will need to give the left wing of the Labour Party something to get their teeth into, and unfortunately it will be we folks in the countryside who are a good target, because we're not huge in number. Not many of those seats will go Labour, some will go Liberal Democrat, the rest will remain Conservative, and in the countryside, and so he will target us in the minute, and I don't think I need to lose much sleep over whether I've got that right or not.
Our viewers are very worried about the direction of travel of gun certificates under the Tories, because although we had sensible approaches under David Cameron, we've had knee-jerk approaches from Priti Patel as Home Secretary, and it's led to a almost unworkable certification system in this country. Labour doesn't really understand guns, and it's always had trouble legislating against things it doesn't understand. Could Could it crack down on guns, do you think, or do you think it'll just ignore them? How will that play?
I mean, if we're fortunate, they'll largely sort of carry on with other things and leave the guns alone. But if they do, I think they'll probably start to try and do total bans. And I think that would be, I mean, I did a lot of work in the Select Committee trying to make our Conservative legislation more understandable. I mean, you have this business where, you have to look at a rook. Is its intentions to come and actually take your crop before you shoot it? Well, I always ask my rooks, and they always are inclined to be going to eat my crop, and I shoot them. But it really is farcical. I mean, some of the stuff. I mean, I when they brought this stuff in to start with, I was going to go home and I said, look, if I've got a crow attacking a lamb, I remember saying this to the DEFRA official, because they will peck their eyes out, as you know. And I said, I shall shoot it. And he said, well, you'll be breaking the law. I said, well, you take me to court then, if you want to. And this guy didn't know what to make of it, because I said, I am not, this is cruelty, and I said, I'm not going to stand by and let it happen. I don't think they have at all the understanding, and I think the trouble with governments, and I spent my life, as a Select Committee chair, trying to make sense of what government's doing, and I think sometimes the ministers have great intentions. I mean, I know George Eustace, when he's sort of reforming all the agricultural policy, he used to say, well, I'm trying to simplify it, but every time I turn round, the civil servants have got hold of it and they've made it complicated again, and I think that is the problem.
The thing about Labour that many people say compared to Tories is when Tory ministers get in, they try and do something. When Labour ministers get in, they try very hard not to do anything at all, which could be good for us.
I think in the past, Labour governments have been quite good for farming, but I think the trouble is now, before you had the Common Agricultural Policy for better or for worse, and so that carried on, and no government could particularly do too much about that. What you've got to realise now is that Westminster elections are going to matter so much more, because the government of the day can change virtually everything about the countryside, and I think that is where we just have to be careful. I mean, if we're lucky, Labour won't turn their guns on us. They will have other things to do, and they will have a lot of work with an NHS and everything else to sort out. So hopefully that'll keep them occupied. But if they do turn their guns for political reasons, probably not guns, because that's not politically correct, but if they turn their political will on to sorting out, in inverted commas, the countryside, then look out.
Do you know people who have been good for the countryside whose seats you worry about? I would name Simon Hart, for example.
Yeah, Simon Hart over in Wales, naturally, in Pembrokeshire. His seat will be vulnerable. You've got people like Richard Drax down in Dorset. His will be. You've got Scott Mann down in North Cornwall. All of these seats. Cheryl Murray, who's can be sort of very eccentric at times, but again a real character. And not only is it farming with her, but fishing as well, because we very often forget fishing, and certainly commercial fishing. And so, yeah, there will be quite a number of seats which I think the Cornish seats in particular could be quite difficult. It
looks like our unofficial Minister of Hunting, Geoffrey Clifton Brown, is probably going to be all right. Impossible to say at this stage, but the auguries are good. James Gray, similarly, Christopher Chope will get through, and of course Bill Wiggin. So we get to keep 4 out of our kind of cadre. But it also looks like that the old stagers of the antis are all going to get back in en masse.
Yes, and I think this is the problem. You're going to have, and all the time you see the parties are changing. I mean, I found in the sort of 2019 intake, while there was a sympathy for the countryside in the Tory party, it wasn't as strong as it was before. And I think, Labour may not, if they want to keep their softly approach, like I said, may be okay. But like I said, it just depends really if they need a political scapegoat, basically, and then that's when it becomes dangerous for the countryside. And I think the Tory party also needs to know what it represents, really, and I think we country folk for a long time are beginning to feel a bit disenfranchised, because you see, we're talking about Labour, but of course don't forget there is the Reform Party, which quite a few people are finding quite tempting. And of course the trouble is, you vote Reform, you get Labour. you don't get reform. And so if that weakens the Tory vote in some of these sort of quite safe seats, I mean, if Geoffrey Griffin Brown loses in the Cotswolds, God help the Tory party, because there won't be many left. Because some of these sort of edge of, these leafy suburbs around Surrey, and those seats are going to be very vulnerable to the Liberal Democrats. Naturally, some of the rural seats very vulnerable to the Liberal Democrats, because you see, basically what will happen in this election is that people will be looking for the party to get the Tories out. We haven't really had this situation since 92, 97. So is it a 92 result where the Conservatives just hang on? Is it a 97 result? Now, my view is it's going to be halfway between. I think Labour will get in between 20 and 40 majority, and I hope they do, because I don't want a hung parliament. Because I tell you why, is that the Labour will do a deal with either the Liberal Democrats or the Scottish Nationalists. Even though they hate the Scottish Nationalists, they'll still do a deal to stay in power, and with that will become proportional representation, and that will keep the Tory party out for a generation. And I've seen it across Europe. You create these horrible coalitions because they've got all this proportional representation voting systems, which everybody says is very fair, and on paper it is, but of course in practice all you do is the tail wags the dog, because all these minority parties control the majority parties. If you notice, it's always the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and everybody else who wants PR, because they know they can wield inordinate pressure on the major party.
Well, you look at Lorna Slater, MSP, she was not officially voted in a first past the post way, and yet she went on to basically wipe out Scotland's dear ministerial position.
Yeah.
You've been through this election process at the moment. I imagine it's a pretty high stress time. If I were a hard left Neil Parish voter and I wanted to get my point across to you during an election campaign, so I'm kind of reverse engineering this. If I were a very pro-hunting voter and I wanted to get my point across to a hard left candidate, how do I do it? What do I turn up at hustings? Do I dress up as a fox and run around the streets? What do I do?
I think turn up at hustings, really, get as much contact as you can with the Labour candidates, explain that countryside sports are very much about maintaining a good environment, a good countryside, a good landscape, as well as the sport itself. And I think just try and widen the argument beyond blood sports, because that's what the left of the Labour Party likes to keep. It's blood sports, it's blood sports, it's blood sports. We've got to talk about it, and if you're trying to convince your left-wing Labour candidate that hunting and shooting is part of the countryside and part of country life, you've also got to look at it's a livelihood issue, isn't it, as well, and just try and say to them, he or she, that lots of jobs are involved as well in the countryside, and with an economy that is still weak, do you actually want to reduce the economy in the countryside rather than strengthen it? And so proper controlled hunting, which they've got now, proper controlled shooting, which I believe they've got, do they need to actually do any more? And I think you've just got to try and persuade them that we have our livelihoods to make in the countryside. We do manage the countryside. We do understand the countryside, and sort of just very delicately try and say to them, please don't interfere.
Would you accuse them of fighting class war?
Certainly, if they are fighting a class war, yes, you can have a go at them, especially if they're making real comments about Tory toffs hunting and this sort of thing. This is what you've got to bring home to them. That is, hunting's not about Tory toffs. It's about all the people looking after the stables, everybody looking after the hounds, the kennels, and there's a lot of really hard-working people in the countryside who are hugely pro-hunting and actually make their living from hunting. You've got all the gymkhanas and the people coming through, youngsters who love riding their ponies and then they go on to hunt. At the moment where you're trail hunting and not actually after killing the fox, then I think it has a really good future as an entertainment sport rather than a blood sport. And I think perhaps that's the other thing you've got to emphasise, that with the Hunting Act it's not a blood sport any longer.
If you want to hear more from Neil, he has his own podcast. Called We Can Do Both, Neil interviews farmers from a position of strength, he's one too, about whether to grow food or to protect nature and, as the title suggests, where you can do both. There's a link to it below.